Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Overview of Transportation Research and Development, Priorities for Reauthorization. I want to welcome everyone to the Technology and Innovation Subcommittee's first hearing of the 111th Congress. This subcommittee was very productive in the 110th, moving the Small Business Innovative Research Program reauthorization, green transportation legislation, the 10,000 train by 2010 health information technology education legislation, and the U.S. Fire Administration reauthorization, and the National Institute of Standards and Technology portions of the COMPETES Act. I'm certain that we can maintain this quick pace in the 111th Congress, and it is my intention to do so on a basis where both sides of the aisle will be participating vigorously in these processes. And first up on our agenda, and the subject of this first hearing, is surface transportation research and development in preparation for the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. I can think of no more appropriate topic for this subcommittee to begin with as Congress concludes debate on an economic stimulus package that includes multi-billions of dollars for surface transportation projects. As we start these and other major infrastructure initiatives, we all agree that we should deploy the most recent, efficient, proven surface transportation technologies to ensure that we're building the highways of the the highways of the future and not of the past. Today's hearing is an overview and assessment of our current R&D investments, their coordination, their focus. This will be the first in a series of hearings as this subcommittee develops a surface transportation title that will later be incorporated into the comprehensive Surface Transportation Bill. In reviewing some of the Transportation Research Board's recent assessments of our surface transportation investments, I am somewhat concerned that the recommendations focus on increased funding as the sole means to overcome the challenges identified, including slow technology transfer and a lack of clear national priorities in DOT's R&D spending. More money is sometimes necessary. They are difficult in our current environment, and sometimes they are not a solution to lack of coordination or lack of focus. What I hope to learn today, and in this series of hearings, is how to make our federal investments in surface transportation research and development as effective, as efficient as possible in overcoming the challenges of congestion mitigation and its impact on our lives and on the external environment. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for taking the time from their busy schedules to be with us today. And now I would like to recognize my colleague from Nebraska, Representative Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to return to business today, and I look forward to a productive and collaborative 111th Congress on this subcommittee. The economic challenges facing our nation are of utmost importance to us all. We must ensure our nation's citizens have the opportunity to create and innovate. We must support entrepreneurship and see that businesses are allowed to become more nimble, more efficient, and more competitive. I believe the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation will take an active role in shaping our economic recovery and certainly competitiveness. I look forward to working closely with you, Mr. Chairman, and the rest of my colleagues on the subcommittee in accomplishing this task. The agencies we oversee on this subcommittee are vital to the nation's health and well-being. The National Institute of Standards and Technology performs cutting-edge research which supports the next generation of computers and electronics, the next generation of fuel-efficient vehicles, and the next generation of healthcare technologies. The Department of Homeland Security continues to perform life-saving work to ensure our safety and security. And the Department of Transportation supports the highways and railways vital to our commerce and way of life. Chairman Wu, we have a lot of work ahead of us, certainly, and all of these agencies may see funding increases due to a stimulus plan, and all will need to have close oversight to ensure we are spending taxpayer dollars wisely. I'm happy our first hearing of the year addresses one of the major challenges facing our nation and Congress this year: infrastructure research and development. We are currently contemplating spending billions of dollars on highway and railway infrastructure improvements. We will need to ask important questions in order to address the issues facing our nation's aging infrastructure. How will these projects incorporate science and technology to extend the life of and improve the quality of our transportation networks? How have our R&D programs performed over the past several years, and what can we do to improve them? We expect most R&D to be relevant to the problems at hand and expect research agencies to focus on the real-world outcomes of such research. The witnesses before us today all have expertise in translating results from the lab to the road. I'd like to thank you all for coming today and sharing your thoughts on how to improve our transportation networks and our research activities. I look forward to starting a dialogue with you during the question and answer portion of today's hearing and hope you will continue to work with us as we craft a new highway bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, it's a pleasure to serve as ranking member of this subcommittee, and I look forward to continuing this bipartisan and productive relationship. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. It is now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Mr. Paul Brubaker is the former administrator of the Research and Innovative Technology Administration of the U.S. Department of Transportation. Dr. Elizabeth Deakin is the director of the University of California Transportation Center at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Amadeo Saenz is the executive director of the Texas Department of Transportation. Mr. Robert Skinner is the executive director of the Transportation Research Board. And our final witness is Mr. David Wise, the acting director of physical infrastructure issues at the Government Accountability Office. You will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for this hearing, and when you complete all of your testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We'll go as many rounds as there are questions or we have time for, whichever arise first. Mr. Brubaker, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith. I'm sorry. I'm pleased to be here today to testify on what I think is a real tipping point in the transportation infrastructure, how we leverage research going forward to transform our transportation infrastructure. I've submitted written testimony, as you know, for the record, but I'd like to highlight some key points in my oral testimony. During my tenure at RITA, we attempted to establish a process by which research funding decisions were made, executed, and evaluated, as well as develop a construct to actually manage research in portfolios based on multimodal communities of interest. We weren't entirely successful. However, we did make significant progress in at least establishing a degree of transparency into the research spend which hadn't been reached before. But transparency is only the beginning. Decisions where to spend the $1.2 billion in research dollars must be based on strategic research objectives established in a holistic, multimodal, and focused national transportation research agenda that covers all aspects of the transportation picture and drives innovation into the system. For all research funded by the Department or through the Highway Trust Fund, outcome expectations and performance measures should be agreed upon in advance, progress should be monitored, and performance should be measured after the projects are complete. The Surface Transportation Authorization provides us an opportunity to redefine how we approach and conduct transportation research in a way that better serves our nation. Before asking for additional transportation research dollars, I strongly believe we must ensure that current dollars are being spent wisely. As it stands right now, nobody, and I mean nobody, can say with reasonable assurance or authority that funds are being spent wisely or in a manner that best reflects the overall national transportation priorities. We have an opportunity to fix this suboptimal situation by creating a new transportation research paradigm. One good place to start is to ensure that RITA, and you might naturally expect me to say this, is both sufficiently resourced and allowed to perform its role that was created under the Mineta Act to coordinate the research spend for the department, but more importantly, to develop that holistic process where the Secretary can select, control, and evaluate research in a strategic context based on a to-be-developed national transportation research agenda that reflects a broad group of stakeholders, ranging from states and localities, the personal and commercial users of our national transportation system, to accident victims, police and first responders, even economic development officials from states and localities. I've made other recommendations, including the establishment of the Transportation Advanced Research Projects Agency, the consolidation of research functions under RITA, and funds set aside for innovative research projects that can be carried out by a variety of institutions and individuals. Those are included in my written testimony. I look forward to a constructive discussion today on ways to improve our transportation research to better leverage our existing investments and better serve the American public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brubaker. Next, Dr. Deakin, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was asked today to speak about some research that we did at the University of California on intelligent transportation systems. And let me start with
Dr. Deakin, is your microphone on?
It seems to be.
Okay, pull it a little bit closer.
Let me pull it closer. Okay.
There we go.
Is that working?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to talk to you about the research findings from our study of intelligent transportation systems and how to get them into the mainstream in transportation. This was a study that was funded by Caltrans, who had spent a good deal of its own money as well as federal funds to invest in intelligent transportation and was concerned about whether they were getting their dollars worth from the projects. What we found in a series of interviews with decision makers as well as with technology experts, and the decision makers were both in the public and in the private sector, was that while there were some valuable gains in such things as traffic signal timing, road tolling, better data collection, cheaper methods for gathering data and assembling it, monitoring the systems and managing them, there also is a concern among the decision makers that there really was a need for a tougher, more arm's length evaluation of the cost effectiveness of these investments. And there also was a need for a business plan for these investments that hadn't yet been developed. And one of the reasons for that was a lack of real focus on institutions and business budgets and costs and effectiveness that really is social science research. There's a lot of interest in what kind of institutions it would take to implement these kinds of strategies. One of the problems is that we have tried to include deployment in ITS projects, but it's been done by the technology experts who are not necessarily the experts in institutions and planning and policy. And so we really think that we need to create a different framework and a different set of research foci that would complement the technology development but really help it move into implementation. And that might extend to new kinds of partnerships and oversight that involves the private sector as well as government to really do a tough business plan for these technologies as they're being developed. I was also asked to address the question of university transportation centers, something that I have some experience with, having directed the center in Region 9 for 10 years. University transportation centers do research, they do tech transfer, and they produce graduates. The graduates are a form of tech transfer in some ways because they would go out into the agencies and the consulting firms and the private sector with the latest knowledge and help deploy that knowledge. So we look at that as an important product. The Transportation Center program expanded greatly under the last transportation bill from to a total of 60 centers now, 20 of which competed for their funds and 40 of which were selected by Congress. My own view is that competition is a very good way to choose transportation centers because it assures that the best ideas are able to compete and win in a kind of marketplace. And I also have to acknowledge, though, that some of the earmarked centers have used that opportunity as a chance to really show that they could develop and have developed and become successful. A big issue on both the UTCs and ITS is measuring performance, and I think performance has to be measured on outcomes, not on inputs, not just on the number of counts of papers produced or dollars spent, but actually what's been accomplished that's changed things, that's made the transportation system better, cheaper, faster, more equitable, more environmentally sound. And we need to move in that direction quickly. One way to do that is to increase coordination in research, which is the third topic I was asked to address. I think that is being done much better than it was even a few years ago because of investments that the Transportation Research Board, that RITA, and that others have made in creating really good websites where we can coordinate the research and see what everybody else is doing. And there really is no excuse for duplication with the kind of information that's now being available. On the other hand, I don't think that all projects that are doing the same thing are duplication. Sometimes we learn by doing multiple cases, and we really need to be able to do that. So replication has to be distinguished from duplication, and we'll go ahead faster and gain better if we do that. I do think that the strategic plan that Mr. Brubaker just described is a critical element in being able to manage research. We have to have a new strategic plan that really represents the new directions in policy that the country is pursuing under this administration and under the changing information about science and technology that comes along. We need to keep that plan up to date and renew it. And I think the partnerships have to go beyond just DOT. They have to go to other agencies in a much stronger way than they have, to agriculture, to energy, to environmental agencies. And further, they have to go to the private sector in a stronger way than they have, because we can't do this alone. And we need some new models on how to deliver our transportation systems so they will be cost effective. And so I really think that plan has to be the starting point. It has to be outcome focused. It has to be across the board, integrating all the ideas and issues that we have to address in the next few years. And we really need to do that quickly so that we'll be able to have a framework for making decisions on what's a good investment in research and technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deakin. Mr. Saenz, please proceed.
Good morning. Chairman Wu, members of the Science and Technology Committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. My name is Amadeo Saenz. I am the Executive Director of the Texas Department of Transportation. Today, I'd like to accomplish several things with my testimony. First, I'd like to give you a state perspective on federal research investment. I would also like to talk about the barriers that we face, some of the stakeholder involvement in transportation research and development, and finally, I would like to list some possible improvements that could make research and development more helpful. Federal investment in transportation research and development is invaluable to the state DOTs. Because of the federal research, we now have high-performance concrete, high-performance steel, and accelerated bridge construction methods. In Texas, our highways are based on design criteria developed through national research. We now use cable barrier systems developed through the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. These barriers have reduced crash severity in our highways. This translates to countless lives saved. We installed, as part of a safety program, over 400 miles of cable barrier 2 years ago. We went back to evaluate those particular highways, and we saw that we were able to save 18 lives over that 1 year and 26 serious accidents from what it was prior to. So measuring what you do and what you put in place is very important. The Strategic Highway Research Program, Concrete and Structures Initiative, is another federal program we found to be very beneficial. The Texas-Luetta Road overpass in Houston was the first project in the country to use high-performance concrete throughout the bridge. The use of high-performance concrete has allowed us to realize tremendous savings and efficiency in the construction of our bridge structures across the state. So far, we estimate and we save about $10 to $20 million a year in bridge construction. In 2002, to demonstrate the impact that research and development has on the Texas transportation system safety and cost effectiveness, TxDOT performed an analysis of 21 of over 200 improved technologies that had been developed through our research program. A benefit period of 10 years was used to determine what kind of returns we were going to get, and the findings showed that the products provided a net return of our investment of over 5 to 1. We are currently have the Texas Transportation Institute updating our report because we now have more data on it, and preliminary indications are that the original 5 to 1 investment is still a good number. These are just a few samples of the benefits that we've been able to realize from the transportation research and development, but like with every other government program, there are some barriers. The competing challenges of relentless congestion, lack of adequate funds, and the need to move people and goods across towns, across the country with really the competing challenges of relentless congestion, lack of adequate funds, and the need to move people and goods across town and across the country demand that we generate answers very quickly. We need to anticipate future needs and begin research today to address those needs. One of the largest barriers to overcome in research and development is to overcome the institutional inertia and resistance to change. When we introduce new specifications, new standards, or construction techniques, we see that there is contractor resistance, and there's also cost increases because of the unknown. Therefore, implementing research becomes difficult due to staffing and funding shortages. And with the uncertain economy that we have today, the state resources are stretched just by maintaining our existing systems, and sometimes research has to take a back seat. At TxDOT, all levels of employees are involved in the research and development program. For example, we have set in place research management committees. These committees are made up of our key administrative and key lead people, district engineers, that work hand in hand with researchers who have the technical expertise in the different areas. This committees establish the priorities and select the research that is to be conducted. We have more employees involved in each of the projects from within the department to ensure that they work hand in hand with the researchers to ensure that everything stays on track and will result in information that TxDOT can use as part of the research program. In addition, the department has also seen very important to set aside money to be able to implement some of the research findings that come out of our research program. And we put in place a $5 million a year budget amount to be able to address, to implement these new technologies that come out of our research program. The federal government can help states, counties, cities with the newest use of the newest technologies in several ways. First, you need to understand what the needs of our states are and what the needs of our local communities are. Information, guidance, requirements developed at the national level should be provided in a ready-to-use format and in an understandable language. And we must also form partnerships between the federal and state DOTs to maximize and share all of our information, our assets, and expertise. We need to all work together instead of all working separately and independently and reinventing the wheel every time. Partnership is a major focus for us in Texas. We believe that only through partnership and coordination we will be able to meet our mission. And the same level of coordination and focus would be helpful in all federal research programs. As Congress looks to reauthorize the nation's surface transportation program and the research that underpins it, there are some simple but important changes that would re-energize the research and would cost little or very little to put in place. Not since President Eisenhower have we had a national plan for infrastructure, and if I had to guess, Congress is starting to think that we need to have a new national plan. Our national plan should not only be for highways, it should also include all modes of transportation, whether it's mass transit, high-speed rail, freight rail, aviation, and ports. We have to measure how well we succeed or how much we have missed our goals. We will need to move into measuring real congestion relief, lasting clean air impacts, safety improvements, and sustainable maintenance programs. That way we know whether we got what we expected from our research program. If Congress is serious about making us perform, then a well-organized research program can get us there. Congress should set our goals, and then the states and the federal government should work in partnership to define what and how we measure our success. We need to avoid developing systems independent of each other, as I mentioned, because this leads to additional cost. A nationally coordinated approach worked well for mapping the Geonome project, and it can certainly help us in advancing our research program and the development of our transportation system. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to provide this testimony. I look forward to your questions, and I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saenz. Mr. Skinner, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Robert Skinner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies. My testimony this morning is based upon the work of expert committees appointed by the National Academies to carry out projects for the Federal Highway Administration's Research and Technology programs and for the Research and Innovative Technology Administration. I emphasize highway research programs in my testimony, but most of the lessons drawn are applicable and transferable to research in other modes. The administration of our highway system is incredibly decentralized, with tens of thousands of states and local governments owning pieces of the system. Even though the federal government owns and operates relatively few highways, It plays a crucial role in research and the innovation process. The federal government funds about 2/3 of the total highway research and technology programs, enables training and technology transfer activities, and is the sole source of funding for higher risk, potentially higher payoff research. Now let me turn to the questions provided in advance and highlight some of the points that are made in my written testimony. The first question referred to R&D priorities, alignment with stakeholders, and changing priorities. The TRB committee that reviewed RITA's first 5-year DOT-wide strategic plan identified several constraints on having a truly strategic plan. The research titles of Safety Lou contain numerous narrowly defined designations, and many R&D activities are earmarked to specific recipients. As a practical matter, most of the needed research identified by stakeholders is mode-specific in character. And finally, the ability for U.S. DOT to direct or control research programs from a top-down perspective is in natural tension with efforts of the modal administrations to be responsive with stakeholders. Given the decentralized administration of the system, responsiveness to stakeholder needs and perspectives is crucial. FHWA may have the most extensive interaction with stakeholders of the modal administrations, but even it could be doing more. Regarding changing priorities, the research proposals for reauthorization that the TRB Executive Committee looked at last spring did not adequately recognize the growing importance of reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions and energy consumption. TRB now has a study underway that will make recommendations before Safety Lou expires regarding research on climate change mitigation and adaptation. The second question concerns improvements to transportation R&D investment structure. In concept, the portfolio of programs funded through Safety Lou is appropriate, but the program as authorized is far more detailed than necessary. Compare that to NSF, which has a budget that's 10 to 15 times greater with fewer line items. Other weaknesses in the structure include too small a share of the funding is devoted to advanced or longer-term, higher-risk research. Policy research is neglected. There's too little emphasis on data collection and inadequate attention to technology transfer. The third question, in fact, addresses improvements to the technology transfer programs. FHWA provides extensive information about new technologies and practices, administers the local technical assistance program, and offers training on new technologies and practices. These activities, however, are not sufficient to overcome fully the significant barriers to innovation that exist. Our recently released report on implementing the results from the Strategic Highway Research Program will provide a model of what is required to assist the states in deploying new technologies and practices. For SHARP products, the committee recommends a large-scale implementation effort totaling $400 million over 6 years that would be guided by a formal stakeholder advisory committee and detailed, publicly available implementation plans. The final question asked about lessons learned from the last reauthorization, the final question asked about lessons learned from the last reauthorization of surface transportation programs. The principles for research articulated in the preamble to Title V are good ones, and I hope they will be retained and, more importantly, followed. They encourage stakeholder involvement, competitive award of funding based upon merit review, advanced research, and a federal program that spans the entire innovation process. Along with fewer, more broadly defined line items, adherence to these principles would restore funding to policy and other core missions, including enhanced technology transfer, and provide flexibility needed to respond to changing needs. Specific recommendations based on our assessment of Safety Lou's Title V are included in my written testimony. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before the committee. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skinner. Mr. Wise.
Chairman Wu, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss research, development, and technology coordination and evaluation at the Department of Transportation. RD&T activities are vital to meeting DOT's transportation priorities, such as increasing safety, enhancing mobility, and supporting the nation's economic growth. DOT's budget in this area totaled about $1.1 billion in fiscal year 2008, primarily for projects undertaken by the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration. Over the years, we and others have raised concerns about DOT's capacity to improve RD&T coordination and evaluation across the agency. As a result, in 2004, Congress created the Research and Innovative Technology Administration, RITA. My testimony has two parts. I will discuss, one, the importance of coordinating and evaluating RD&T to ensure federal dollars are used effectively and efficiently, and two, the progress RITA has made implementing the 7 recommendations in our 2006 report on coordination and evaluation of transportation research at DOT. On the first point, in today's environment of expected trillion-dollar deficits and stimulus spending, the need for careful RD&T decisions is more critical than ever. Coordinating and evaluating research are key elements to federal stewardship of taxpayers' money. The Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, a joint committee under the auspices of the National Academies of Science, has recommended a formal research coordination process to enhance collaboration, explore research questions, and reduce inefficiencies. In addition, the committee notes that evaluating agencies' research against established performance measures helps assess research quality and achieve agency goals. In the same vein, the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 requires federal agencies to set performance goals and measure performance against those goals to ensure the effectiveness of federal investments. GIPRA's emphasis on results suggests that federal programs contributing to the same or similar outcomes should be closely coordinated to ensure that goals are consistent and complementary and that program efforts are mutually reinforcing. On the second point, while we have not performed new assessments of RITA since our 2006 report, we have tracked the 7 recommendations from that report. These 7 recommendations are summarized in the table on pages 3 and 4 of my written statement. RITA has implemented 5 of the recommendations aimed at preventing duplication of research efforts, ensuring research is evaluated in accordance with established best practices, establishing database systems to inventory and track research, communicating research evaluation efforts to Congress, and documenting the process for evaluating the results of multimodal research programs. RITA has implemented a strategy consisting of ongoing internal reviews to coordinate RD&T activities and look for areas where joint efforts would be appropriate. RITA has partially implemented the 2 other recommendations, directing it to develop performance goals, an overall implementing strategy, an evaluation plan, and performance measures. As a result, it's still a challenge for RITA to determine its relative success overseeing the effectiveness of RD&T activities. In conclusion, since becoming operational in 2005, RITA has made progress towards becoming a DOT-wide resource for managing and determining effectiveness of RD&T activities. We'll continue to monitor RITA's efforts to implement our 2 open recommendations. We look forward to assisting Congress as it considers RITA's activities during the reauthorization process. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wise. And now we will open for our first round of questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Brubaker, you referred to some of the challenges that you faced as head of RITA, and Mr. Wise, you and your organization have performed a lot of analysis on RITA's functions. There has been some reference to RITA's responsibilities versus its authority to implement what it's responsible for. Mr. Brubaker, would you care to expand on your experiences in facing the frustrations of that? And Mr. Wise, if you care to join in, or any other of the panelists.
Sure. You know, I said sometimes being at RITA, I sort of felt like John Belushi in the movie Animal House, where he runs out of the room and he says, "Let's do it," and nobody follows him. That's kind of how it felt dealing with some of the cultural obstacles that we faced in the department. We do have, frankly, the responsibility and the authority. The legislative authority is very clear what we're supposed to do. What we ran into were some cultural obstacles to change. And I've got to tell you, I'm kind of shocked, and GAOs used to getting criticized sometimes, and they're going to feel weird because I'm a little critical that we actually met 5 of their open the recommendations of the 7, and partially achieved 2 of them. I would strongly suggest they go back and really take a hard look at all 7 of those vis-a-vis RITA and see really and make a judgment on the efficacy of how we responded, because
So you're actually saying GAO might have been too generous.
I think they were, frankly. There are but they may not have reviewed.
Moment.
We may have just done a really good job of responding to the open recs or something. But the reality, from my perspective, was there was just so much more we could have done from a select, control, evaluate perspective of the research portfolio. But we ran into every mode sort of wanting to play hide the ball and protect their existing portfolio of research. Made it very, very difficult to ensure that the underlying research was strategically relevant. Now, we did, like I said in my opening testimony, we did achieve a level of transparency. We know what the underlying research projects are, but we have made no value judgment relative to how they fit in the overall strategic direction. Do they plug in nicely to the strategic buckets that are described in the strategic plan? Yeah, we were able to force fit most of that research, but the grim reality, in my perspective, is that we weren't particularly effective at creating a process by which we could actually control the research through its execution and then evaluate it in terms of outcomes.
What mechanisms do you think RITA needs to implement to achieve that?
It's like my good friend Lieutenant General Bob Shea always used to say, at the end of the day, it comes down to leadership. I think there's a leadership issue where you've got to have strong leadership in the RITA position. You've got to have accepting leadership among the modes. You've got to have strong leadership at OST, where the Secretary says, "Thy will be done," to push the authorities and to ensure that the authorities are actually executed. At the same time, I think there are some structural things that are missing. Like I said, the National Transportation Research Agenda. I don't see that. We've got this RD&T strategic plan, and frankly, again, the first pass at it was a force fit of all the existing research into the strategic plan of the department. Didn't really reflect a strategic direction or a very good alignment of research, the research portfolio, to achieving the objectives of the department. That's what's got to happen, but it's got to be broader than the objectives of the department. It's got to take into account stakeholders, universities, users, economic development people, because the transportation infrastructure is so critical to the economic health and well-being of this nation. We saw it over the summer when fuel prices went up, astronomically. We saw the impact that had, and frankly, I think we're still feeling the effects of that increase. What would have been great if we would have had the data and the research capability to do modeling and simulation and be able to understand the impact that would have on the supply chain, on modal choices, and ensure that we were responding appropriately. And we just simply didn't have that knowledge because we've never laid it out that is strategically important.
Mr. Wise, I want to give you a cut at it, and a couple of you also referred to cultural issues in research. I want to finish up with that, and I'll also announce from the chair that it is my intention to use a soft gavel in this hearing since there are only 3 of us here, but there will be a gavel. But please proceed with this set of answers about this topic and the cultural issues, and then we'll proceed to Mr. Smith. Mr. Wise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, thanks to Mr. Brubaker for his frank opinions and interest in the GAO report from 2006. I think it's important to make the point that when we did this work, which is now probably just over about 4 years ago, RITA had just stood up. It was a new organization, and essentially we were looking, it had just taken the place after the Minette Act of RISPA. And we were basically looking to see that processes were in place to do the mission that it was set up to do. Quite frankly, we have not been, other than following up on the recommendations that indicated these processes are in place, we have not really done a formal assessment to go back and see how well the organization is actually carrying out all its responsibilities. That's something that, if the committee were interested, it maybe would be a useful project as the committee sees fit. So in that respect, it's difficult to give a learned assessment of how well RITA is doing because it really wasn't the focus of what we did in that 2005-2006 work.
And before we finish, anyone who wishes to address the inertia or the cultural issues, and I heard that mentioned by more than one witness. Dr. Deakin, please.
It seems to me that the cultural issue is really very serious, actually, and we have organizations that are modeled in many cases for building the interstate highway system, and they haven't really changed the organizational structure much since. They're very hierarchical. They're rather slow in being able to respond to things. They're pretty top-down. That's not true across the board. Some agencies have actually tried to innovate the organizational structure, but it's pretty true for a lot of these agencies, and that there isn't any real incentive for change, partly because there's no outcome focus in the legislation, and partly because there's no outcome focus in the state legislation saying you have to show what you're actually producing in terms of cost effectiveness of the investments, producing outcomes like economic prosperity, lower costs for users, environmental quality improvements that you can measure and demonstrate, greenhouse gas reductions, more equity in your system. We could give them those kinds of mandates and say, we want reports to come back and tell us what these are going to look like. And we haven't really done that. Now, Congress did that with reports on the state of infrastructure some years ago, and it took a while for all the states to get used to having to collect data and report it. They didn't always do it well, but gradually they all got so they're reporting these data, and those data have been very useful. So again, giving them a mandate and saying, do this, lets the best states do what they're already doing and gives everybody else a push. Everybody does better, and you actually could measure outcomes and not just dollars spent and you know, what's being turned over, but see what we're actually accomplishing with these investments. So I think Congress could take leadership on giving us some clear mandates to show what we're producing. Thank you.
Mr. Skinner, if you...
Just very briefly, I think Dr. Deakin is correct in relating...
Microphone.
Excuse me. I think Dr. Deakin is correct in relating the cultural challenges to the institutional challenges that we have. And one could imagine an institutional arrangement that is not nearly so decentralized without so many thousands of players who own our transportation system. And we could imagine that. We might think that that would be more effective not only for research but for managing and operating our transportation system. And that may be true, and that's a big question. But from the research perspective, research is unlikely to drive that change in the institutional arrangements. And so the research community is confronted with this enormous technology transfer challenge. And so the question of stakeholders and how to involve them and how to have them meaningfully connected to the products and connected so that when products come out, the skids are already greased for them to implement and try these products. That is an critical feature of any strategic approach to R&D and surface transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skinner. We may return momentarily to these cultural issues before we move on to some of the output and metrics sides. And meanwhile, I want to recognize other members of the panel, particularly Mr. Smith, who has been very forbearing in permitting this series of answers to be completed. Mr. Smith.
Thank you. This is all very interesting, especially as a relatively new member, to listen to the various challenges, and I appreciate your willingness to tackle these. And I think it speaks to kind of the largeness of the issue, the complication of the issues, not even to mention funding, funding of research, and then funding of carrying out that research in a useful manner and in a way that leverages other opportunities. I know that we had some controversy in Nebraska when the director, when a person said that the Department of Roads in Nebraska really wasn't in the economic development business. And you can imagine that there was some resistance to that statement, and for good reason. And when I look at the various issues, whether it's the energy issue of our vehicles, we have much different issues in rural America than urban, where in urban America we subsidize less vehicle travel, and virtually in rural America we subsidize more vehicle travel with various roads and systems. A hybrid, for example, the benefits are less meaningful when a commute is done at 65 miles an hour, or maybe a few more miles per hour on the way to work and home. So the benefits are certainly less. So I think we need to allow some flexibility. That being said, Dr. Deakin, if you would perhaps point to maybe a specific research project that you could identify where many of the obstacles that have been mentioned here have taken place, maybe how you would change things, but maybe a specific project as tangible as possible, if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. The project that was mentioned by several people in our research was the installation of call boxes along the freeway system in California at a time when wireless technology, cell phones were proliferating already, and the call boxes, I think, had a useful life of about 15 minutes. It's a very, very short period, because by the time they were actually out there and on the road, most people were already using cell phones. So it really wasn't paying attention to market. The project kind of got put in a pipeline and pushed through because the money was there. It had been allocated, and get into a program of projects, and it wasn't an effective investment of the funds. That's a situation where I think if the remedy is pretty obvious. If there had been more discussion with the cell phone companies, with all about the technologies they were developing. We're sitting right there with Silicon Valley people who know about marketing for these things. I disagree a little bit with Bob Skinner. I think there is a lot of research on how to change institutions. It's done in business schools, not in transportation institutes necessarily, but making those connections could happen. I think there are opportunities to begin to think about how to really bring private marketing, private knowledge about markets, and also university research on institutional change and markets into the play much more than we have. And that's how I would fix that kind of a problem.
Okay, thank you. That's a perfect example. I appreciate hearing that. Even in places other than Nebraska, I'm sure, we have what I think is a response to gridlock that is very reactive in nature. It's kind of like, well, let's wait for the problem to form and then we'll solve it. I guess, Mr. Brubaker, if you wouldn't mind responding to how we could get beyond that, what obstacles you currently see in place. I know it's going to be funding, a part of that. But again, I would say with the funding issue, I mean, the more successful we are with conservation measures, when we fund our roads with a per gallon fuel tax, and there are fewer gallons being used, but yet more vehicles, more tires on the road, wheels on the road, that's not a sustainable formula. If you could respond.
Sure. I just, at the end of the day, yeah, everything winds up being a resource issue, but it could be a resource allocation issue of existing resources to solve things like congestion, or, for example, I mean, you heard Bob Skinner mention, $400 million unencumbered for SHARP. Well, that's all fine and good, but is the $400 million better spent in some other areas, like, for example, congestion mitigation, for example, rural safety research that involves more than just roads. It can involve some other things. It can involve some behaviors, human factors stuff. It's not all about the hockey pucks. I mean, the concrete research. I mean, I'm all about, it's great to have different types of asphalt and appreciate all the geographic disparity and the reasons to better understand and spend money on research for concrete and asphalt. But, we've got to kick it up a higher level and look at this more holistically, like you say, in terms of, what we can do and where we're best spending that limited resource that we already have before we start talking about more money.
Okay, anyone else wish to respond? Mr. Skinner.
Let me just since it was mentioned, the Strategic Highway Program implementation effort is not directed at concrete and asphalt research. It's a large scale safety accident causation project, a large project aimed at renewing our highways in a more accelerated manner with less disruption, longer lasting afterwards. Another piece is dealing with non-recurring congestion incidents and the like, and figuring out ways to reduce that element of congestion. And then another piece that's oriented towards planning and environment, looking for streamlined ways to plan for new capacity in a more environmentally sensitive and community sensitive manner. I think all of those things would fit it within strategic objectives that one would come up with for the department as a whole in our transportation system.
Okay, thank you. I'll have more questions later.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Lipinski, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing early on. I know that this is an issue that is really very important to me, being not only on the Science and Technology Committee, but also on the Transportation Committee. I also have a background in engineering. I studied something called Engineering Economic Systems, was what it used to be called at Stanford, but there's a lot of operations research, optimization, all kinds of puzzles we worked on trying to solve, and trying to give us the skills to solve these puzzles, which really relate very well here when talking about transportation. There are, endless possible goals that we could have, and I think it's very important that we're here talking about what these are. I mean, are we just going after, trying to lessen the traffic congestion? Are we trying to cut down on fuel usage? Are we trying to make the roads safer? Then other questions of, besides talking about roads, are we talking about rail? What about just in general intermodal, transportation, not just for people, but also for freight. And you can get into endless questions here, and we could so much better, I think, be using our transportation system that we have and planning our transportation system if we really got our hands around some of these issues. And I'm very happy to be here in the Science and Technology Committee and hear a witness talk about how crucial, as Mr. Brubaker did, how crucial transportation is to the economy. I hear that all the time in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, but not oftentimes here. So it's good to hear that here. So I just wanted to. There's so many different things that we could talk about, but I just want to first of all question for Dr. Deakin and anyone else who wants to respond. Are we really making sure, or how can we make sure we get the best bang for our buck for money that we are spending here? There's a lot of great ideas, and as you put out that example there, where we put the call boxes out on the road, but we missed the fact that the technology would be changing, and it really wouldn't be that useful. What can we do to get the biggest bang for our buck with ITS systems and the deployment of ITS systems? I mean, I see these signs along the road, electronic signs, that I don't really see that they're being put to much good use, but we put the money out there, so.
Yeah, the signs that say congestion ahead when you're already in a stop-and-go traffic jam aren't particularly helpful to any of us, I think. But I think we're getting better at some of this. There's some technologies that have more applications than others, and this one example I would give you relates to Mr. Smith's question about what do we do about fuel taxes. We're getting a lot better devices that would let us measure vehicle miles of traveled in unobtrusive ways that don't invade people's privacy. We all know the fuel tax We could raise it if there were political will to do that, and it would last for a while, but cars have to get more efficient. They're going to change. So that doesn't seem to me to be a long-term strategy. And if we started implementing technologies that would let us monitor vehicle miles traveled in cheap, fast, safe ways of doing it that still protect people's privacy, you also open up the possibilities of congestion pricing in those places where it's needed and there's political will for it, which is not everywhere, but is definitely some places. It opens up the possibilities for making it easier for people because I could pay my toll, I could pay my parking, I could, get around in my transportation system a lot faster. And there are similar things we can do in transit, by the way, so I don't want to make it sound like this is just for highways, because there are a lot of options in transit as well. But that's almost a no-brainer, in my opinion, and it's the sort of thing where the big issue right now is which technology. Are we talking wireless? Are we talking radio signal devices? So they're technology competitions, but in some ways that seems less important than the fact that we have to start testing those technologies and giving the states both the authority and probably the mandate to do it would be one way to get going on that. For making sure that these things are cost effectiveness, there's nothing like doing a business case. And that's what I've seen missing. Is really the development of business cases. And again, I think business cases are often best developed by third parties who are a little bit arm's length and not necessarily the advocates of the project, just because you need somebody else with eyes on this to make sure that we're really making wise decisions on the investment. That's what we do when the private sector is working properly, and we try to use business cases to test that. And then post hoc evaluations. We just haven't seen very many post hoc evaluations. And again, they have to be done arm's length, not by the project proponents, because if they're not arm's length, then they're always a little suspect. So stepping back, and those are kinds of research that can be, there's research components to that. There's also practical partnerships that can be done to make that happen better. And I think, again, the legislation could help encourage that kind of arm's length evaluation. Learning from that arm's length evaluation would then happen. They could require business cases be developed. I actually think a lot of the DOTs are trying to do this and would welcome having that kind of support, saying, yes, we have to do that. We have to spend our money in a smarter way than we've been spending it. And then focusing on outcomes. What are you actually wanting to get from these projects? It's not just churning the dollars out. It's seeing that we actually have a lasting value that's cost effective. And we know how to do that. I used to work in Terman before I moved up across the bay to the private, from the private to the public sector. So I know your program that you're a graduate of, and as you know, there are lots of people who know how to do these kinds of evaluations. We could put them to work.
Thank you. Mr. Wise, do you have?
Yes. I think that something that might be of interest to you, either in your role in this subcommittee or on your role on House T&I, is that we've just started recently some work on real-time traffic information systems. There's a subset of ITS. And of course, I defer to Dr. Deakin, who is a recognized expert in this field. But just kind of getting into it in the beginning, we're looking at some areas that I think might be getting at some of the things you were alluding to in your question. And we're looking at things like the coverage that exists on real-time traffic information technologies, the information that's available on the impacts and costs of the systems. And then I think one of the more interesting aspects is the options for developing a nationwide real-time traffic information system and the potential benefits to and the barriers to developing such a system. In different parts of the country, of course, it means different things to different people. If you're in the western suburbs of Chicago, congestion is a major issue. If you've got a 60,000 square mile district, then and there's an accident on the interstate, it's good that somebody can know about it. And as Dr. Deakin was mentioning, there's serious questions about how the technology, it's a very fast-moving target right now with lots of evolving technology. I think there's some interesting pilot work going on out in the Bay Area on GPS, cell phone technology. I think the private sector will probably be playing a major role here. And question is what will be the DOT or the government's role? So there's a lot of interesting issues out there in this area. So we'll be happy to keep the committee apprised of the progress as we work through this issue.
I just want to mention something on this Safe Trip 21 pilot that Mr. Wise is referring to. that's really something that I don't think would have been done in the normal construct. We actually were able to pluck that out at RITA and sort of lead that, but pull together a lot of different multiple modes to make that happen. That's a transit, that's a highway, that's a very, that's an individual mode of transportation, be it bicycle or walking. I mean, there's a whole host of things that play into that, which is really kind of an interesting approach and a unique approach. But we started with kind of the outcome in mind of what we wanted to present. And as somebody who knows systems engineering pretty well, you know that we really kind of designed the protocol in a way that would support that outcome that we wanted to achieve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Dr. Deakin, when you referred to Terman, were you referring to a building? And
Yes, I was. That's the engineering building at Stanford.
yeah, spent many a lovely evening at the Earth Sciences Library nearby.
Yeah.
Wonderful place. Mr. Saenz, did you have something to add to the last?
Yes, sir.
Back and
And I
forth.
think one of the things when, the question was, how do we make sure that we get the best bang for the buck? And, I think it starts from being able to identify some goals within your research arena, or really some goals in the management of the organization that will lead to some goals and then how do you measure them? And one of the things that we started doing in our research program a few years back is we put in place the teams at high level that were the experts, both from on the department side, academia side, and even the private side, to identify some goals that we wanted to accomplish in the research management areas. And one of the things that we really look for is we wanted to identify some research that would result in the implementation of a technology that would give us a savings. Very similar to what I talked about with we used some of the national research on the barrier cable, but even within the department, we looked at what can be looked at that will help us create a much safer transportation system, and then how can we measure what we're accomplishing. And that leads to ensuring that you spend your money in a safe and wise way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saenz. Ms. Edwards, please proceed.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Mr. Brubaker, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on, and good that you're the former administrator, because I think sometimes you can see things differently inside versus outside. And I wonder if you might elaborate on priority setting. I think it's easy. It's an easy answer to say, well, we just need more money to do X, Y, and Z. And I know that some of your testimony you focused on priority setting and rejiggering the kinds of research that we're doing. And so I wonder if you might elaborate on that.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. What we've never really done, again, and I've mentioned this in my written testimony, is establish this National Transportation Research Agenda, which I believe should really be the driver of all the research investment, rather than try to force fit, activity that we're already doing, things like SHARP, for example, that we're already doing into specific buckets. And I don't mean to pick on, the Federal Highway Administration, but they kind of want to be left alone in that prioritization process, as does Federal Transit, as does rail. Everybody wants to kind of be left alone and do their own research. And I think it's absolutely critical that we call a timeout, we take a step back, we assess what we want our priorities to be, we clearly state those in terms of what kind of outcomes do we want. For example, I had the Intelligent Transportation System Joint Program Office under my purview when I was at RITA. I actually shared it administratively with the Federal Highway Administration, which created some really interesting situations, which I can elaborate on offline. But the point is that they've always sort of just been doing projects. And what I asked them to do was really focus in on what they wanted to achieve in terms of, did they want to take a safety focus and reduce the 6 million crashes that we have every year using intelligent transportation systems, making a big dent in the 40,000 lives that we lose every year, and make that a priority, really design the research program to how to have a measurable impact on reducing crashes, reducing the fatalities, reducing the the $230 billion in economic costs that we incur every year because of those 6 million crashes, and put it in terms of outcomes. And then how do you basically reverse engineer the research program to achieve those results? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, but on a macro scale for the entire nation. What are like the 5 or 6 things that we really want to accomplish? Reduce congestion, greenhouse gas emission reduction, rural safety. I mean, what are the big impact things that we need to do? Then we need to look at that $2.1
Then
billion.
how do you develop a system?
Right
that
on.
handles it?
We've got to take that $1.2 billion and then begin to plan how we spend it to achieve the outcomes in those big areas. So that's what I'm talking about.
I appreciate that. Let me just, Dr. Deakin, very quickly, can you talk to me a little bit about what you think that the appropriate role for social science research is in thinking about a more coordinated transportation system? And I want to just share with you, I know locally we have an economic development team that works on economic development in one pod, and then you have a set of transportation people who go, ooh, we're doing an economic development project. We need to think about transportation. And those things are thought about very separately. And so the rail people are one place and the roads people are another place. And it never seems that we're really looking at the linkages there. And then how are we going to use that? How, as a consumer, what does a system mean for me? And so I wonder if you could talk about the way that we could use social science research base to inform more strategic thinking around transportation planning.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It seems to me that those linkages are exactly where social science can shine and make a big contribution to helping us figure out how to do this better. Because the social sciences, which I would include planning and policy sciences as well as business administration and management sciences as part of, are a bunch of people whose expertise is to really think about organizations and organizational behavior and how to create collaborations. There's a lot of work that's been done on collaborative processes. Some of that's theoretical, some of it's evaluating different processes to see which ones work and which ones don't, and very practical. So there's a whole range of social science work that's looking at how different organizational structures, how to flatten organizations, because we've got a lot of evidence that flatter organizations are more efficient, that networked organizations like Google are not highly hierarchical, they're pretty flat, but they've got a lot of networking and a lot of linkages. The importance of informal networks of knowledge as a way of really quickly getting new ideas out in the field. It's not, that people go and read papers, it's they call their friend that they know because they met him at a meeting or a conference and say, hey, what's going on in your field, or what do you think about this idea, and how to facilitate that sort of behavior instead of punishing it, which actually happens in some of our current organizations. Don't talk to your boss's boss without permission or you might be in trouble in hierarchical organizations. Of course, talk to your boss's boss and then tell everybody what was said is a flat organization approach to that. So that's what's coming out of the social sciences on how to restructure institutions, new institutional ways of doing business. Studies on public-private partnerships. What does it mean to have a public-private partnership? That term captures a lot of territory, and some of these partnerships work well, and some don't work well at all. And we really need to get that knowledge into people's hands about what's been effective and what hasn't been effective. And that's social scientists who are doing that research. I think it's a question of specialization. My colleagues who are mechanical and civil engineers and electrical engineers and computer scientists are really good at what they do, and I don't want to try to do their work for them because, boy, I couldn't do it. By the same token, they're not necessarily very good social scientists. They're not necessarily the best people to be doing evaluations. They're not necessarily the best people to be thinking about markets or institutions. There are other disciplines that do that, and that's where the social science people, I think, really can help us a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. And since we've had a couple of folks on this side of the aisle, Mr. Smith, why don't you proceed?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Saenz, in your testimony you state that the boundaries of various state and federal programs need to be defined more clearly. And can you describe how the multiplicity of R&D programs affect planning and operations at TxDOT?
A lot of times as we're doing our work, we we work with different areas. We got planning, and you have the more of the technical side, and then sometimes we don't have the good communication or the good coordinated effort. What we've been trying to do at our level, at the state level, is, as I do have the research management committees, we also have an oversight committee that is made up of all of the chairs of our research management groups, as well as our key administrative staff of the department, so that when we can coordinate, and then that way we can communicate with the different areas as we go up to the federal side. All I think we need is more cooperation, more coordination.
Okay, thank you very much. It's interesting as we hear, kind of a request, somewhat of a request for more clearly defined programs. That if you get too detailed, then I think we discourage that cross communication, and so that's interesting. And I'm not criticizing your suggestion for more clearly defined responsibilities, but do you sense any obstacles such as that?
No, I think what we are trying to get is, I think we need some definite goals, and then we can work together at both the state and the federal level to identify the strategies as well as the implementation plans. And then at the same time, we can define the roles and responsibilities of each, so that we don't have the duplication of efforts. And we in essence, get more done with less. Is where we're trying to get at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I have sort of two major areas that I want to explore, and then two smaller areas. And at least in this round, the major area I want to open up, to the extent that folks don't want to continue talking about cultural issues or inertia, because I want to fully explore that topic before moving on. But in a related field, a number of you have referred to a concern about developing a coordinated research agenda in moving to outcome-based measures. And I wanted you to finish addressing any of the cultural and inertial issues that we face, and the challenges of moving to a coordinated research agenda, and what would be outcome-based metrics, and to give further examples and elaborate on your written testimony. Whoever wants to begin to take a cut at those areas. Mr. Brubaker?
If I may, yeah. I'll try to keep my answers a little briefer than they've been in the past here. I just remembering from my staff days. It's really interesting that as we look toward developing a coordinated agenda, to understand that how we move people, how we move freight today is multimodal, it's multidimensional, it's multidisciplinary, and keeping that in mind. So you've got to bring. And I think Dr. Deakin really nailed it when she said, how you approach these things. It's not just a civil engineering problem. It's an electrical engineering problem. It's a structural engineering. It's social science. It's economists. All of them have to be in the room to help develop this thing.
So the problem is siloed
thinking,
yeah.
Right? You go to. And here's the problem that I've got. And with all due respect to Bob Skinner and TRB and Federal Highway Administration with SHARP, is that it's housed in federal highways. You're more likely to get a federal highway type answer to the question, even though it might be taking advantage of a multimodal problem, even like cooperative freight research, for example. We've done research and funded research and are aware of research where we track shipments of things like seafood from the Pacific Northwest down to the southeast of the United States. And we see that it travels by short sea shipping, it travels on rail, it travels on the highways. So you've got to have an in-depth understanding of all those things, plus the economics, plus the behavioral issues, to really understand how that system works holistically. I keep coming back to this term holistically because things really are multidimensional, multimodal, and multidisciplinary. And you've got to break down that silo thinking. And there's really no place in the department, I think, to do that other than RITA.
Anyone else? Mr. Skinner, since you've been referred to.
Yes. Well, I just want to emphasize what I think is that it's an enormous challenge to have a broad, integrated research plan. The transportation sector is roughly the same size as the healthcare sector. And so imagine what our comprehensive healthcare research R&D program would look like. Now, I'm not saying we are as good as the healthcare sector in constructing a research plan, but I just want to stress the enormity of the task that would be before us. And linking that, I think a strategic plan, yes, it has to think about the goals, it has to think about outcomes, but it also has to think about processes and how do we allocate our resources across the entire innovation cycle so that some research, which is in a highly applied nature, relatively can be implemented fairly soon, then we can judge it pretty easily, perhaps, with respect to its rate of implementation and its outcomes. But other research, such as, say, the SHARP work on understanding accident causation, crash causation, it will be years before that fairly advanced research is translated to specific changes in the way the vehicle is designed or the roadway is designed. But it holds the promise of giving us the knowledge that we need 10 years from now, 15 years from now, from having breakthroughs and understanding the interaction between the driver and the vehicle and the roadway and accident causation.
Thank you for that insight, Mr. Skinner. When you think about it, the healthcare sector, the transportation transit sector, and the housing sector are of roughly equal size. If you consider the amount of research that goes into each of those and the nature of that research, it's very, very different. If you consider energy savings, the building and housing sector is much more ripe than either transportation or some of the other areas. Anybody want to address the I'm sorry, Dr. Deakin, or anybody else wants to address the metrics side of this challenge? And Dr. Deakin, you may have something on the existing topic.
Yes, actually, I've been doing some research on how other countries are actually handling this problem of a research agenda, and we're falling behind our competitors on this. The EU countries, Canada, Australia, all have been trying to develop these kinds of strategic plans that are really focused on outcome. And the kinds of outcomes they're measuring are we getting good value for dollars spent? And what's good value? They're measuring, are we getting faster, cheaper, more reliable transportation service than we would have without that investment? And for how long, over what period of time? Because not all of them last forever. Are we reducing greenhouse gases? Are we reducing pollutant emissions? Are we providing better service to everybody? Is service equally, equitably distributed to our population? So those are measures of outcomes. Is there basically they're looking for economic performance, and economic development is certainly one of those things that you want to measure. To help get you better, more access to jobs. We can argue about how to actually measure those things, and there's a lot of research actually that's been done on what are good performance measures and not so good performance measures that we can look to on this. So I think measuring outcomes is something that we can actually look to our trade partners for and see how they're doing it, and, borrow their ideas and build on what they've done and go a step better and get ahead of the game on this. So I don't think that part I think we could do pretty easily. I think there's a difference between focusing on what to do and focusing on what to achieve. And the what to achieve is the outcome measure. With what to achieve, you might say to people, you decide what's the best way to improve the reliability of your transportation system, but you got to show that the reliability is being improved. And they figure out what's the best way for them to do it in their own situation. An output, that's really different from saying a highway design manual where you have to look it up and do it by the book. And we've done, I think, a little too much of the by the book, we're going to tell you how to do it, and not enough of the we're going to focus on what you accomplish by making those investments. Final point I would make, and this is echoing something Bob Skinner just said, sometimes we do need to set aside money for research that is not immediately tied to a product, because that long-term research is incredibly important. And I want to speak on behalf of Caltrans in this. Caltrans had the confidence in its universities that it gave us matching funds for our transportation center funds without earmarking a penny of it. They didn't tell us what to spend it on. And we ended up with a very mixed portfolio of projects, some of which were very applied and actually were done with Caltrans, but some of which were on topics that weren't on the national or the state agenda, including research that was done on what we could accomplish in transportation systems with new fuels, new vehicle technologies, and travel demand management strategies, transportation pricing studies, all of which were done well before any of this hit either the state or the national agenda. And because of that, I think we're way ahead of the game in being able to provide leadership on these issues as we're all coming to the conclusion we need to address these kinds of topics now. Because we've got that research that started in the late 80s, early 90s, and we kept building on it. And it wasn't, we couldn't have said at that point, what did this study on transportation pricing alternatives actually do for Caltrans, or for anybody else for that matter. But now we can look at that study and use it and say, well, here's some ideas and here's some analyses that actually show you what we might be able to accomplish if we did a VMT price instead of a fuel tax, or what we might get if we did congestion pricing and how effective it would be and where it would be. And oh, by the way, what are the politics of congestion pricing in our major metropolitan cities? Because that's not a straightforward thing. So we did that research. There wasn't a clear tie to deployment immediately, but it's helped us 10 and 15 years later.
Terrific. Before I turn to Mr. Smith, anybody else on this topic? Mr. Smith, please.
Thank you, and anyone wishing to respond to this. But when we talk about the matching fund requirements and changing those to a heavier federal side of the funding, what do you think, how would that impact? Obviously, it would free up funds locally or at the transportation, the TRBs. And given the fact that we've heard criticism of current research programs as lacking the technology transfer, are the UTCs capable of turning long-term projects into the real-world benefits given a funding matching funding change?
Bob, you want to start? No.
Okay, I'll start. I imagine this is a topic others will. You have a center director here with us, and you have the former administrator responsible for UTCs. And as mentioned in my testimony, a committee that we had that looked at the Federal Highway Administration's research program, of which a big component of UTC research is highway research. That committee recommended that the matching percentage drop from 50 to a 20% match. And the argument there is that many states were not operating in the manner that Dr. Deakin described California, in that they did have expectations if they were providing matching funds, and those expectations were towards fairly highly applied research products. And the universities have this opportunity, which Dr. Deakin has explained, to do longer-term, higher-risk, blue-sky research on the areas that we haven't thought of. And our committee felt that that was being stifled to a degree by that matching percentage. And so if the matching percentage is reduced, the universities would have a greater autonomy in setting their own agendas. There would still be the opportunity for overmatches by states and others. Some universities, no doubt, would choose to continue to do highly applied research, but other universities might choose to go off in the direction of longer-term, higher-risk research, and others might have a mix, like Dr. Deakin described.
Mr. Smith, may I jump in just for a second? I understand where we're going with this change from 50-50 to a 20% match, but can't you earmark just as effectively with a 20% portion and leverage the other 80?
I think in certain cases that would happen, but I think it would certainly happen to a lesser degree with 20 than it does with 50-50. As you said, even as Dr. Deakin explained, even with the 50-50, California allows quite a bit of latitude. So I think our committee, whether the number should be 30, should it be 15, should it be 0, they settled on 20 as a step in the right direction.
Do you want to? Okay, I'll go next. On a non-controversial subject, my experience with the 50% match is that it works and it leverages the dollars that we invest into the system. I come back to the sort of the fundamental objective for what historically we've tried to achieve under the University Transportation Center program, and that is training the next generation of transportation leadership. That, in many cases, in fact, in most cases, involves training individuals who go out and work in the field. Work in the field on applied, on real live applications, things they need to do. So there's been a criticism that the program's a little too focused on applied research, and I don't know that that's such a bad thing when you're actually training people who need to go out and work in the field and be marketable. And if they're doing really the squishy sort of basic research where there isn't really a solid performance type outcome, but it leads to other research or furthers the state of knowledge, which, by the way, is very good, then I would expect that person or those people to be a little less marketable or a little less attractive to the field. So, frankly, I think the program's been fairly effective. I think, well, actually not fairly effective. I think it's been very effective in the current mix and how things are sort of arranged. And I would hate to see us tinker with something that I think is fairly well leveraged today and fairly well balanced and produces the result that we expected to create.
Anyone else wishing?
I obviously have a self-interest in this topic. We have over 100 faculty members in the UC system who participate in the UC Transportation Center. And we let any faculty member who does transportation research at any of our campuses compete for funds. The funds are reviewed entirely outside our university by people who don't have any close connections. It's an NSF kind of review process. Caltrans also reviews them, and then we meet and prioritize which ones that will be funded. We use the USDOT research agenda as one of the bases for prioritizing what we fund. We also use Caltrans research priorities since they're providing matching funds. We, as I said, end up with a mixed priority. We've produced literally 100 students a year for 20 years who've gone on to work in transportation. So that's a pretty big chunk of people coming out of that program for the investment. And many of them have now risen to positions of leadership in my home state in California. Both assistant directors at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission are graduates of our program. Jose Luis Moscovich of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority, Christine Monson of the Alameda County Taxing Authority, Malcolm Carson of the LA DOT Commission for the city, and I could go on and list all kinds of people who've been out of school for a while and now have risen to positions where they're in considerable positions of authority and really providing a lot of leadership. So we're pretty proud of that as part of our product in addition to our research product. Frankly, we couldn't have attracted some of those students into transportation as opposed to another area of work if we hadn't had the ability to offer them fellowships and graduate research assistantships through our research. And if we got hit with a cut, and Caltrans might be generous enough, our state budget is in a terrible situation, so I'm not so convinced. We might get some of the match, they might not be able to do it. I don't think it's because they don't love us. I think they do love us. I think it would be because they don't know where their next dollar is coming from. So that kind of a loss of match would certainly hurt us, would hurt our ability to produce the students, would hurt our ability to produce what I think has been overall a very positive set of research findings, many of which have been implemented, many of which are changing policy and creating new ideas all the time. So, it's basically a cut in funds for the transportation centers is I think the only way to realistically look at that. Doesn't mean that we couldn't make it up later when it looks like Caltrans we might have a budget this year in California. I scrambled around and looked at foundations and found money from Hewlett and the Energy Foundation, but even they now with a downturn are telling us that they've lost 30% of their endowments, and so that's not even going to be easy in the future. So I think you have to look at it as if you cut it to 20%, it's going to be a cut in the amount of funds, cut in the amount of the research, and a cut in the amount of product that you're going to get, and that's That's the only way I can interpret it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. A number of you have referred to technology transfer problems, consulting with end users, implementers, before proceeding on research, in the course of research and in implementation phases. Could you expand on some of the pinch points, some of the impediments, how to overcome them, your recommendations for more effective tech transfer going forward? Whoever wants to start. As an end user, Mr. Saenz.
And I think I will tie it really to not just the research program, but anything that we do. We in Texas have 25, the state is broken up into 25 districts. Sometimes I think we have 25 departments of transportation. And a lot of our district engineers and a lot of those offices work independently, and they try things, and they do things, and they evaluate things, and they identify best practices. And even within our state, we were having problems in sharing that information so that the state could benefit as a whole. One of the things that we've been trying to do as a whole is, under my administration, I put in place an assistant executive director that is working with all of our outside offices to ensure that we do get that kind of information collected, presented, using different methods through reports, through being able to use technology, chat rooms, so that we can get that information to the other people across the state, because we can generate some efficiencies. The same thing can be done in the research program. We already communicate closely, but I think we always need to look at what we're doing today and how we can make it better. Because we thought we were communicating as a state and sharing information district to district because they communicated, but we found out that there was a lot of things going on that one area of the state did not know anything about. So we need to always go back and look at what we're doing, how we're doing it, how we're sharing it, and how could we ensure that we are doing it. Again, you measure your success of what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saenz. Mr. Skinner.
We could talk all afternoon about tech transfer, and I'd probably enjoy it. We manage cooperative research programs, what we call cooperative research programs, in highways, transit, and airports. Each one of those programs is governed by a committee that's not created by TRB. The institutional arrangements vary, but for example, the research committee of the Association of American State Highway Officials governs our highway committee, and the Secretary of Transportation appoints the governing group for the airport program, and so on. These programs are highly applied, and so the tech transfer problem is not nearly so great for that kind of research, because stakeholders know what their problems are. They program money to deal with those projects. Oftentimes they're connected with the association committees and the operators, and so the panels that we put together that steer the research have the people on board that would help with technology transfer later on. So those kind of programs work very well, but I would never claim that the entire research program should be comprised of these programs. They don't handle cross-cutting issues very well. They are at the highly applied end of the same. They're not doing the longer-term stuff. And for those kinds of programs, implementation is a considerable challenge, particularly when it must ultimately trickle its way down to county road officials. So they're relying on, there's no perfect set of things. The Federal Highway Administration has a local government assistance program. That's good. Many local governments have terrific relationships with states and depend on mimicking essentially state practices and materials and design. MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, probably depend heavily on their own network and individual contact for improvement in planning methods. And champions and getting states to go out and pilot and then lead the way for others is terribly important. So again, I just would stress that this is a complicated subject. There's no one answer, and there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox that have to be employed.
Oh, believe me, we work on tech transfer, whether it's from NIH labs to transportation to nuclear detection. And I guess it's what I think Boswell or Johnson said about dogs walking on their hind legs. It is not done well, but one is amazed that it is done at all.
Oh, right.
And a lot of the world thinks that we do it better than most, but I'm kind of amazed by that too. Mr. Brubaker, you had something to say.
Ditto. I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I'm going to say something which may be a little controversial here, but it's designed to have a little bit of an impact. But I don't think tech transfer is truly a priority of the department's research program, and it needs to be. I think the priority needs to be clearly stated. I think it needs to be programmed. I think you need to take some element of existing resources and direct it toward a tech transfer and commercialization type activity. I used to serve as chairman of Virginia's Innovative Technology Authority, and that whole authority was established almost exclusively initially, when it was initially established, to do tech transfer from Virginia's colleges and universities and laboratories and to ensure commercialization of the most promising technologies. And Virginia, frankly, had done a really good job of doing that and helped manage the SBIR program in the context of tech transfer and doing some other things. So I come at this with that background. So I actually believe that there should be a very deliberative, programmed activity around technology transfer and commercialization where we can glean some best practices from some of the universities that do a really good job, some of the state associations that do a really good job, some of our overseas folks who do a really good job of it. Glean those best practices and apply them. I'm amazed at some of the things that I've seen in terms of technology transfer by some of the universities, particularly. I think UC Berkeley has a good good program. I know Texas A&M does because we've gotten underneath it pretty substantially, and I think there are some clear lessons that can be learned by that. But I'm perplexed because, and I do think this is again a function that really needs to be in RITA, and I'll tell you why. Because I'm really perplexed by how you can promote something like the Universal Freight Shuttle that was developed down at the Texas Transportation Institute, which is effectively a new mode of transportation. It's a monorail, effectively, that uses individual rail cars that move freight containers ideally when it's originally deployed, when it will be deployed, it'll be Monterrey, Mexico, through Laredo, up to a land port in Dallas-Fort Worth. At least that's the initial design of it. But it doesn't fit nicely into federal railroads. It doesn't fit nicely into highways. But here this is this great innovation, and I know that they had a heck of a time trying to figure out how to commercialize something like that, how to get the knowledge out. One of the things that I think we fall victim to in the department is we tend to have researchers and create forums where researchers talk to other researchers, which is a form of tech transfer, but it's not necessarily getting the technology out in a forum where it can be effectively utilized. So I think we need to take a look at this. I think the department needs to make it a priority. It should be a priority in the next reauthorization, and it should be programmed and resourced effectively.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brubaker. Anyone else on this topic of tech transfer impediments and procedures going forward? Dr. Deakin.
I think there's been a model of tech transfer that it's something that happens at the end of a process, that you develop research and then you move it forward into refinement after refinement, and then eventually you deploy it, and at that point you start doing tech transfer. And that's, I think, a recipe for failure, that kind of a model. I think you have to start thinking about users' demand markets in the beginning. And one of the, if it's short-term research, as Bob Skinner pointed out, that's easier to do than if it's long-term research. But in other areas, we have business councils and business science councils that help talk about these things and keep this on track. And there are other mechanisms, I think, that can be devised that would help us integrate thinking about where are we headed, what's the vision for this, what's the scenario that we have in mind. And Mr. Saenz was saying to me that he thought that three things we ought to be doing is scenario planning, and having think tanks, but also doing scenario planning and then doing evaluations on projects. Each of those could use some guidance from people who are really thinking, what's the vision here that we have? Is that a realistic vision? Challenging that at the beginning, sharpening up that vision of where it's going. Let me give you an example. A problem we have in California a lot is that people say, gee, if we could manage the freeway system and the arterial system as a couplet, then everything would be a lot more efficient. And we could spread traffic around, we wouldn't have so much congestion. We could make use of the capacity better. Well, if the arterial happens to be the kind of arterial where having more traffic on it is okay, that might work. 2/3 of the time in our experience, those arterials are main street, residential streets, shopping streets. They've got all kinds of other values associated with them, and maximizing throughput is not the objective of the owners of those facilities. And so we've actually had to change our thinking about that and recognize that we have to do context-sensitive design and context-sensitive operation. But I still hear my colleagues on the technology side saying, gee, if we could only operate this system as a whole, not even recognizing that there are these other values that have to be brought in. And that's just a question of not communicating with the right people, because other people could tell them, let's talk about the context in which that will work and the context in which that won't work. So starting to think about deployment, starting to think about markets and public consent and people's values and how what's being proposed fits with values and markets and preferences, really from the beginning seems to me to be critical to make tech transfer work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deakin. Before we turn to what I hope to be one final topic here, Mr. Skinner, since I made a at best neutral comment about one of your findings earlier, I wanted to return to that and give you a chance to address it. In your written testimony, there was a number of a $400 million increase in research funding. And before we head into a, shall we say, a disjuncture between aspirations and resistance to additional research funding, I want to ask you about where you get your number about 0.9% percentage of sales research for transportation versus 3.6% percentage of sales in other industries, and also to give you a chance to address what I take you to say as not just an increase in current surface transportation research, but perhaps a reorientation of that research into other fields where there may be current research going on, but to associate that with transportation. Please proceed, Mr. Skinner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That's quite a lot. Let me first start by saying that I certainly didn't want to leave the impression, and I don't think our reports wanted, and the committees wanted to leave the impression that the answer is money and money alone.
We have parallel goals.
That regardless of the resources that are available, there are a variety of things which our committees have documented and is in my written testimony that we can do to make our research programs, technology programs more effective. The 0.9% of total expenditures is arrived at simply by adding up all of the highway research program spending that we can find in the United States and comparing that to total highway expenditures. And that compares with this 3% figure, which comes from it's not compiled by us. It's probably compiled by the Commerce Department. It's referenced in our report. And I think you'll find in the private sector that even mature industries spend at least 1%. And
let me ask you about that. You're probably including industries like pharmaceuticals, where the spending is in the mid-teens. You might be including technology industries where the spending is a slightly higher percentage. But if you compare to, shall we say, heavy industries like steel or ag, that might be perhaps more although it's unfair because we're also talking about computer systems for transportation.
That's right. I mean, that's my, you're making my point that that's quite a range. It's 1 to 10 to 15%, depending on these very high tech industries and the like. And my point there is that this is not a low tech industry. Yes, we have very mature technologies that are difficult to change, like asphalt and concrete, but we have intelligent transportation systems. We have very complicated institutional problems that the private sector doesn't deal with. We have behavioral issues related to safety and travel demand and the like. So yes, as to where we should be in that spectrum, we're just observing that we're on the on the low end.
So it's different percentages, if you will, a different baseline for different parts of transportation research, because it is a large segment of the economy, just like healthcare, just like construction.
Right. I mean, we spend, I think, probably 3 times more to try and save a life in our cancer research than we do in research related to highway safety. So, but now let me. So that's the first number. Where did we get the 0.9%? The other one was the 400 million, which is relating to the total expenditure that we estimated in a congressionally requested study on the implementation of the Strategic Highway Research Program products. And there's a little bit of a crystal ball work there, because the research program is still just fully underway, and we were required to submit a report this year. But it's illustrative of how much importance our committee placed on the tech transfer process and its complexity. In this particular case, I will say that there is a bit of apples and oranges, because I've referred earlier to the accident causation piece of it, where at the end of the SHARP program we'll have a very large database. So that 400 million also includes the care and feeding of that database, as well as further research on the use on that database, which will hopefully give us the products that will make its way into vehicle design and roadway design. So
Now, do you have a recommendation about the proper amount of funding for the next appropriations period, for the next highway bill period, and what the uptake limitation might be for the research infrastructure that we currently have in place?
thankfully, I do not have a recommendation.
I'll tell you what, for each of the panelists and your friends in the research community, that's a question that I'm very, very interested in, and I'm sure that other members of the committee would be very interested in that as we develop the research title of this reauthorization.
Right. I mean, our committee has, we've observed that we could, the more money could be justified, but certainly if the money were doubled or something of that nature, there'd be a capacity issue that you're referring to. And regardless of the money, there's a host of reforms that we can make to make the overall program more effective.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Mr. Skinner. Anybody else on that topic before Mr. Brubaker?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to this that I said in my oral testimony and that I refer to in my written testimony, and that is that I think it's really difficult to assign. I don't know how you can assign a number as to what the right number is for what we should be spending on transportation research. I go back to that National Transportation Research Agenda as sort of being the driver. The right number is the number that it takes to spend on research to achieve the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. But I would really caution that the thing to do or to ensure as part of the process is that there is an ability to select, control, and evaluate the research portfolio. That is, and I view that as an inherently governmental function. It should rest somewhere in the department. In fact, I think the development of that plan and the monitoring of the execution, I believe, should rest in RITA. And moreover, I mean, if somebody really wants to increase the funding, maybe make it, maybe gate that funding. Maybe make it, there's a percentage increase that increases every year of the authorization, where perhaps it's predicated on successful implementation of such a construct of oversight, if you will, where you're actually controlling and evaluating those underlying research programs. That, I think, would be a responsible, frankly, approach to that type of a discussion.
Terrific. Thank you. Dr. Deakin.
I guess I take a slightly different way of thinking about this myself. We could draw a technology innovation curve and think about that as when you're first starting to develop technologies, high risk, potentially high payoff, you got to spend a lot of money on research. When technologies are well understood, well deployed, the rate of change or the rate of innovation slows down a bit, and this is an oversimplification, obviously, you don't need as much research money. And so the question is not just a question of how much do you need in transportation, but what are you going to do in transportation and where do you want to put that money on the innovations or on the stuff that's relatively stable. And that's a curve, and you can actually do an analysis and figure some of that out, I think, a little better than maybe we've done in the past. We've had a tendency to staple together everybody's proposals in the past, and stapling is not the best way to do this, I don't think. The other piece of it is I think this is a huge question about what you want to count as being as part of the problem, part of the problem set. If you think about the supply of transportation, just the supply, you've got vehicles, fuels, operations, and facilities. And DOT doesn't do most of the vehicles and fuels. Those are actually private sector, EPA, and DOE. And if you're going to talk about transportation systems improving as a whole, and you're only talking about the facilities and operations, you're already shooting yourself in one foot. If you don't recognize that the private sector has to be part of that discussion because they're producing most of what we're talking about, you're shooting yourself in the other foot. So it seems to me that that's a big issue, that the way DOT has been organized and the difficulty that DOT has had, not just internally, which Mr. Brubaker spoke about, but also in creating those partnerships that go to EPA, that go to DOT, that go to Department of Agriculture, that go to housing, because there's a big housing community development aspect, that go to commerce on the economic development aspect, are also part of what would really have to be discussed seriously here. And that affects how much money you want to spend in research, because it doesn't seem to me that all the research is necessarily going to be inside Department of Transportation. It might be in these kind of new forms of organizations that might be semi-formal, that is, they might be partnerships mandated by Congress among agencies that create networks and advisory committees to supervise how the dollars are spent. They're really different from what you've been doing, and not all internal, and might not be in RITA at all, or might have RITA manage part of the process, but have to be told, create these partnerships and do it in a different way.
Well,
so I just think we could open this up and really think about
with too.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, and that is part of the opportunity and the frustration of this moment. You're quite correct that the transportation issues are not just in DOT, and it would be much better to have linkages between DOT and DOE, for example. But this committee, the larger Science and Technology Committee, does have jurisdiction over the research components of DOE and DOT. Yeah. And the opportunity is that the new Energy Secretary is very, very enthusiastic about moving forward on a broader front and coordinating with other agencies, and is very cognizant of issues of culture and inertia. And in fact, to speed up the research process in his agency, he is looking at bringing in folks from ag because they've dispersed funds faster traditionally. Right. So that is part of the reason why we focused on cultural issues a little bit, because there's a lot of discussion about how to get agencies reoriented to address issues. I mean, we push legislation out of here, and we kind of assume that it's done when we push the legislation out, and it could be 3 to 5 years later it hasn't hit the ground yet. Right. And I just want to be very sensitive to the multiple layers that it has to go through before it hits the ground. Mr. Brubaker?
I'd like to add something to that, because I think we did something fairly unique when I was over at DOT that in the alternative fuels arena, where we did engage Department of Energy, and we had really close relationships with the folks in EERE on the energy efficiency and renewable folks. We had good relationships with them, particularly as it related to hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and battery development and some of the things that we were really interested in. To my knowledge, I hope that that activity is still going on, but that was informal. And I think as we begin to have a new generation of people who come into the government service and are used to collaborating and are used to dealing with Facebook and are used to picking up the phone and asking people questions no matter where they sit or what organizational stovepipe they're in, that is going to be more of the rule rather than the exception. But I'll tell you, I got a lot of raised eyebrows when I first started to engage our colleagues at the Department of Energy on these issues. And initially, there was some dancing around turf battles and, like whose turf is what. But when we broke through all that stuff, I think we had, and they played an integral part in the success of a hydrogen road tour that we did over the summer, where we took a fleet of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles from Maine to Los Angeles across the country. And we were in lockstep for that particular project. That wasn't formal. It wasn't mandated by anybody. It was just something that we did. At the same time, at the secretarial level, we were not at the plate at all when gas prices were going through the roof. But the impact that as fuel prices were having, on the transportation infrastructure, our supply chain, and our passenger movement system was profound. And it's unfortunate, but I almost think it's sort of a generational issue where people are used to collaborating when they're somewhat younger or more interested in that sort of thing. And when you get to sort of the older folks who are used to working in their rigid agencies and, they're getting advice that they have to stay in that lane, that occurs. And fortunately, I think technology is going to break down all that stuff ultimately, and create new paradigms for work. But I just wanted to offer that concrete example, although it's not a concrete example.
No, thank you very much. I've always thought of myself as a young pup, but now as I get older, I find that I'm more sympathetic to the old dogs, and maybe I am one. But there has been constant reference to the sociological aspects of organizations and technology, and a more internodal approach rather than a pyramidal approach to problems and organizations. Anybody else on this topic before we move on to my final one, and I'll also give you all a chance for a catch-all at the end of this. Well, for me, the last topic I have is the proposals for reorganization of UTCs, or organizing them differently. We've already addressed the splits for funding, matches, and we might return to that at a different moment in time as we get closer to reauthorization. But there's been some discussion to a competitive process versus whatever you would call the process that we currently have. It occurs to me that we have 50 centers, we have 50 states. That could be a coincidence. But, I know that coincidences do occur. I just haven't seen one in Washington yet. But to the extent that any of you would like to address what it would look like to have a competitive system for UTCs and awards, what the criteria would be, I'd like to hear I'd like to have your input on that topic.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to. I'm very. I hate to say this in this way, but I can't think of a better way to say it. I'm passionately indifferent to whether they're competitive or not. I've seen ones that have been competitively awarded. I've seen ones that are earmarked, and both. To the large extent, are effective. There are a handful that may need some help on both sides of that equation. So frankly, it's not one of my the recommendations that I am passionate about in any way, shape, or form. So I just think, not that I want to say don't rock the boat on this thing, but it seems to be, the system seems to be working reasonably well. I'm a big proponent of competition. I love competition in contracting and, everything else. But the reality is I think we've struck this delicate balance, and it's probably best not to expand or contract in terms of the number of centers. Contract because I don't think anybody wants to deal with the political fallout that is a grim reality of this situation. But at the same time, I'm more focused on what can you do to make, whether they are earmarked or competitive, more effective.
Well, I was not aware that this issue existed until fairly recently, and I guess I'm trying to decide, Mr. Skinner, whether I should be passionately indifferent or passionately care about this, since you all have had some recommendations. Let's hear from you next.
Yeah, I think on this topic, and I think I'm on firm ground in saying throughout the work of the national academies that we consistently come down on the side of competition and merit review as one of the hallmarks of quality control in scientific research. Now, does that mean that someone can't do excellent work at an earmarked center? No, of course not. And the program is fairly mature now, so that it's conceivable that the current portfolio of centers is better than the ones that we had 15 years ago. But I do think that if one did want to open up a purely competitive environment and restructure the program in that manner, I think there would be this question, which Dr. Deakin alluded to, is the dual purpose of the program. Research on the one hand, but also attracting young, talented professionals into the field and giving them a good educational experience. And that's it's not that you can't do both of those things, and probably there are many people in this room that were in programs that did both. But I think it would require some thought, because there are other ways to provide support for graduate students besides University Transportation Center's programs, and so that would have to be considered if we were starting from scratch.
I'd say that the centers actually started out as a competitive program in the first round in 1987. Unfortunately, the competition was organized by federal region, and transportation excellence isn't necessarily distributed evenly by federal region, and so that wasn't purely competitive in the way I would think you'd want to organize it. If you look at the earmarked centers, they're a very mixed group. Some are top research universities. Two that come to mind immediately are Northwestern and Minnesota, either of whom would be able to compete very effectively for research dollars. Some of them are much more modest local teaching colleges that are not known particularly for research, and the research is modest. And I would actually leave it to their own state and local people to tell us whether they're producing the people that they need, because I see those as workforce development investments for those centers. And I think RITA has encouraged that aspect of it, that they really try to make sure that they're measuring whether their people are ending up going into transportation jobs and being productive in those jobs. So looking at that dual role, that's certainly been an issue, is this business. One thing that I've thought about that might be a way to manage this process, I believe in competition. I think competition sharpens everybody up, makes us all work harder, think harder, try to get creative. It's good to get a push. So I don't mind having to compete. I think it's actually good for us. And if we got our comeuppance, I think it probably would teach us a lesson. So we'd do better the next time. So I support competition. One strategy that's been discussed and has operated in the past has been you get an earmark, but then after a few years you're expected to compete. And there won't be as many centers as there are competition, or maybe new people can come in and compete as well. And I think that's actually worked pretty well, because it's removed from the process some centers that really weren't able to be productive, and let other people who might not have either the political connections or the famous professors yet to get into that process. And some of those centers have really developed and become good research centers, frankly. So some of the earmark centers. So I think we've seen the earmarks being productive in both producing people and producing research in at least some cases that would be competitive on any ground. So I would say go for a process that encourages competition periodically after an initial period, even if there are earmarks, because that sharpens everybody back up, lets those centers that haven't been able to get their act together and perform be removed from the process in a rational way, and lets other people take a chance and say, we want to do this, we think we can, and go for it.
Yeah, if I can add one additional thing, though, I want everybody to be really clear that the money that is designated for the UTC program only represents a portion of the work that gets done. Obviously, you've got the match issue, but frankly, most of the UTCs that I go to collect a lot of additional money from Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, really the Department of Transportation, and as well as the private sector. They do privately funded activity that builds on that foundation, whether it's an earmarked UTC or a competitive UTC. So, I mean, they've sort of stood alone for the most part. They kind of stand alone and have their transportation credibility, if you will. I think that's a relatively positive impact. Now, there are other universities out there who are not UTCs at all, who get millions of dollars in federal money from the Department of Transportation. Give you a prime example. Virginia Tech is one, for example. They do a lot of great research. They get quite a lot of money from the Department of Transportation as well as the private sector, and operate outside of the UTC program. The only issue that I've got with that is I don't have the same visibility into what goes on there as I do into the UTC program as former RITA administrator.
Okay. Well, as we look at this issue, I do want to capture the strengths of competition, but recognize that we have different missions to perform, whether it's research or workforce development. And also recognize that there are failed or imperfect markets or competitive environments. Because in a country like ours, it's hard to criticize competition or merit review unless you look at the history of how some of these organizations or processes developed. And in the development of the science establishment after World War II, it was dominated by a few institutions. And into the 60s and 70s, the peer review mechanism, shall we say, was just far from perfect, because people knew each other. People knew each other's work. So even in a blind analysis of publications or grant proposals, you knew whose proposals were coming through. So any reconsideration of this has to take into account the realities of whether a merit review truly is blind or not, the multiplicity of functions ranging from personnel development to applied research to fundamental research, and sort of the shifting centers, the foci of research. Who would have thought that Wisconsin would be a biomedical research center 60 years ago? I'm not sure that anyone would have thought of that. Those things need to be kept into account as we consider this going forward. I want to invite any of you who have any closing comments to make. You all have traveled a good long distance. If you have anything else to add to this process overall, I'd like to invite that at this moment. And Mr. Saenz, and I want to apologize to you as someone whose name has been spelled out and mispronounced for a long time, myself.
You've pronounced it perfect.
Oh my gosh, you're very generous.
Pronounced it.
Thank you, sir. I think I've massacred it at least once or twice today.
Mr. Chairman, I think just going back and just based on our prior topic about earmarks versus competition, we at Texas thrive on competition. We think competition brings the best of both the public sector and the private sector in trying to solve problems. I think one of the things that starts with all things, but especially in the research program, is we need to have a national plan. And this national plan can be there to solve for not highway solutions or rail solutions or public transportation, but we need to look at it as a whole and holistic to try to identify how we solve those transportation issues. And it may be a rail project, it may be a highway project, or an aviation project, intermodal system, but we need to look at it as a whole, having that one focus, having that one goal, that one plan, and then be able to then look across lines and also at the same time be able to figure out how you measure success will lead to a better program.
Terrific. Thank you very much. If there is nothing else for the good, Mr. Brubaker.
Just briefly for the good of the order here. First of all, I just want to commend you and the ranking minority member for your leadership on this issue. I think this is really critical, and like I said in the opening, represents a real tipping point in our ability to transform the transportation infrastructure and make it more flexible and responsive to our needs. The one thing that, and you know this, this goes without saying, and I don't want to minimize the complexity of this issue, but at the same time, I've been in Washington long enough to know that when people use the word complex, they really mean can't be done, don't bother doing it, don't bother breaking the rice bowls, don't bother breaking the stovepipes. I firmly reject that. I think this is a very manageable situation. I think we just need to look at it from a high level. I think Mr. Saenz said it very well when he said, you know, we need that plan. We need that holistic plan. For example, you know, if we're thinking about how to best move congestion at the ports, well, if you give that project to the Federal Highway Administration, they're going to give you a highway answer. You give it to Federal Rail Administration, they're going to give you a rail answer, but it needs to be some holistic answer. And I think the only organization within the Department of Transportation that has the ability to focus multimodally and holistically is in fact RITA. Lastly, I'd be remiss, and as an ex-staffer I always love to do this, I want to thank Megan and Mike and Travis and Victoria for their help here, and certainly Shep. And Shep, I know it's your last day. We're really going to miss you over at the department, and really just appreciated your service here. So thank you.
You're good. You're good. Anything else for the good of the order? Well, I want to invite all of you to think. One topic I did not get into at all today, and we will save this as the topic of a future hearing because it's a very big topic, and that is green transportation, green infrastructure, and better ways to plan and do things so that we are cognizant of the footprint that we leave both today and in the future, and looking at our inputs as well as outputs. And I want to commend that set of considerations to you all, because I know that many of you, or all of you, have been dedicated to that already, and will have suggestions for us as we go forward in considering the green transportation and green infrastructure issues, and as we go forward in developing a research title for the surface transportation bill. I want to thank you all for appearing now this afternoon, and thank you for coming a good, decent distance. The record will remain open for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions that the committee may ask of y'all. The witnesses are thanked and excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.